Hey everyone, for today's Ed puzzle, you get me, Miss Fortgren, explaining your lesson to you, and we are talking today about cell theory. And I have some quick review of information of the 6th grade benchmark, as well as some cool stuff that I thought I would show you guys relating to cell theory. So first, I want to start out and test what you guys already know about this. I've got a few Ed puzzle questions built in here for you. And first, I want to know, what are all living things made of? All right, and you should have answered. If you didn't, that's okay. We're reviewing this now. All living things are made of cells. And I also want to know, what do those cells store in their nucleus? All right, all cells store DNA in their nucleus, and it carries your genetic information. And when cells are replicated, that DNA is replicated with it, so that your genetic information, or the genetic information of any living organism, gets passed on from cell to cell. This is important because we're going to talk a little bit about viruses in a second. And viruses actually differ in how they store DNA, or whether they actually have DNA at all. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Lastly, I want to review, can living things be made of only one cell? All right, and yes, some organisms are what we call unicellular, meaning they are made of only one cell. And I'm actually going to show you guys some examples today of unicellular organisms that I found in my own backyard. All right, so to get this going, we are just going to describe the three parts of the cell theory. We've already got some important parts, that we know all living things are made of cells, and cells can even be unicellular organisms. We're going to go over those three parts right now for you guys. Now, before we get into that, let's talk about how living things are organized, because this is important for the first part of cell theory. Organisms, they're living things made of tiny particles, and those are those cells. Smaller than cells, we have molecules and atoms, but those things are not alive. So, the smallest level of organization of a living thing is cells, which are still made up of those molecules and atoms, but they need to combine in a specific way to create organic material, um, and then form to create cells. And then cells combine to form tissues, which combine to form organs. An organ can be like your heart, or your liver, or your lungs. Those combine to form organ systems. And then those organ systems form organisms like us. One human is one organism, or a bird, or a plant, or any single living thing would be considered an organism that has all of these types of levels of organization. All right, so I'm going to ask you this question on the Ed puzzle and see what you guys got. If you can remember the levels of organization from least complex to most complex. Least meaning less, and most meaning the greatest. Okay, so cell theory really started coming about, and scientists started putting together the main components around the time that the microscope was invented, because it allowed people to see microscopic objects. Um, Most cells are very, very small. Some single-celled organisms can be big, but for the most part, cells are small, especially the ones that make up multicellular cellular organisms like us. Um, so the creation of the microscope, and as microscopes got more and more advanced, cell theory began to take shape as scientists got to actually see cells and what they were made of and develop that theory. It has three main parts, but the first part is just simply that all organisms are composed of cells. They can be made of one cell or more cells, but to be considered a living thing, you need to be made up of at least one cell. Examples of unicellular organisms, things like these organisms called paramecium, all of that paramecium is just one cell. Things like amoebas, bacteria, and even yeast. The yeast that we used in our balloon rising experiment, when we put that balloon over the flask of water, sugar, and yeast, each of those individual yeasts was made of one cell. Plankton from SpongeBob, most plankton are also just one cell, single cellular, and what plankton would look like if he was living in the real world. This is a small plankton under a microscope. All right, multicellular organisms can be many, many, many different things. Animals, plants, even things like sponges, insects, and this here is a multicellular organism called a rotifer. And rotifers, although tiny, although microscopic, are still made of multiple cells. All right, now what about viruses? Viruses are, of course, a pretty hot topic right now, and just understanding viruses, where did they fall? Are they multicellular? Are they unicellular? Well, viruses are made of a piece of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, but never both, and a protein coat. So they are not actually made of cells. So there's actually a big debate in science on whether viruses are actually alive or not, because they don't meet that criteria, this first concept of cell theory, that in order to be a living thing, you need to be made of cells. Now, viruses actually do something really unique in order to replicate. Because they cannot replicate on their own, they hijack host cells in whatever they're infecting, whether that be a human or an animal or whatever, and they hijack that cell and use the cell's machinery that the cell normally has to replicate itself with the host DNA, and replicates the virus's DNA for it. So it just takes advantage of the fact that living cells have machinery that it does not, and uses it for its own gain to replicate itself inside of its host. All right, so I wanted to show you guys some examples. I thought I could come up with some unicellular, multicellular organisms that I could find in my own backyard. You know, I'm here, I'm quarantined, I couldn't go out and find a bunch of examples for you, so I went straight into my backyard to this little pond that I've got in my backyard. It's got a bunch of little fish in there, it's got some tadpoles, but I didn't want to show you guys those. I wanted to look a little closer. So what I did was I grabbed some of that pond water, and all I have at home is this really old microscope. The microscope's probably about 50 years old now. And I grabbed some of that pond water and I said, you know what, I want to look at that pond water under the microscope and see what we've got. So I put some of the algae in the pond water, and some of that pond water on a microscope slide to see what was hiding out in the water and the algae. So I put it on here, just a little drop of water. That's all I put, just from the tip of my finger, dipping it into the pond water onto the slide, and put it under the microscope there to see what we could find. Now, first, you look closely here. All of these are bits of the algae, and we're not looking at that. I want you to look at the smaller things whizzing around in the algae. So you've got all those little dots. That one's spinning around. Those are spinning all over the place. Those are actually single-celled organisms. And you think, wow, you know, how can something move on its own, only being made of one cell? They have their own mechanisms of movement, these things called cilia, um, these things called cilia that cover the outside of the cell, that allow it to move through the water. So those are called ciliates for that reason, and they are made of one single cell, the entire organism. Other single-celled organisms I found in our pond water are these things called diatoms. Diatoms are a type of algae, and there are these two different kinds that I found in there. There are these little stick-looking things that don't have cilia like the other things do, so they don't move. But they are their own unicellular organisms all the same. And then, even in that tiny drop of pond water, I found multicellular organisms as well. So you think multicellular and you're like, okay, it's got more than one cell, so maybe those cells packed together are going to make it bigger. But even in a drop of pond water, you can find things made that are more complex, made out of many cells. And the ones I found in here are called rotifers. They have their little body here, and usually this stalk that sticks out of the back that helps them move. And I got a couple videos of these guys to show you. So that's our rotifer right there. And he's hanging on to this piece of algae right here, looking around in the pond water. Right, and then here I got a video of a rotifer. He's going to come out from right there, along with some other little ciliates floating around him. The rotifers are a lot bigger than the ciliates. Oh, and there he goes. All right. So I wanted to give you guys a few examples of those, even ones that you might have in your own backyard. But let's finish this up and talk about the other two components of cell theory. First, I want you to think about where the new cells in all of these images are coming from. So where did the new cells that are showing up in these photos, the new cell, one that created the two, these are replicating really fast, where did they come from? All right, so those cells all came from an originating cell. This one cell split into two, or these two split into four, this split into eight, which takes us to our second part of cell theory, that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So new cells are made when old cells divide in half to make new cells. And this division, like this cell is doing right here, is a process called mitosis. All right, and finally, cells are the basic unit of life. So this means that cells and all the little parts inside perform all the essential functions for life, including obtaining oxygen, food, water, getting rid of waste. That's why organisms can be single-celled, because even though they're just made of one cell, that one cell performs all of the essential functions to live on their own, getting their oxygen, their food, their water, and eliminating their waste. That can happen all in one cell. The organelles by themselves are not considered the basic units because those organelles standing alone wouldn't be able to perform all of the functions. They come together to make the cell that perform all the functions together. All right, I have two practice questions for you guys that you might see on quizzes, exams, things like that about cell theory. So I'm going to give you these last couple minutes on this ed puzzle to answer those. All right, so I just wanted to come on here, get to actually talk and teach to you all, show you something that I thought that I hoped you guys would think was cool. And yeah, I hope to see you guys in more Ed puzzles soon, and I hope we have a great week. Talk to you guys later.